A man lunges at a teenage girl at an ATM thinking she's an easy target. But before he can grab her, her dog moves faster than any ordinary pet should. In an instant, he's on the ground, pinned, unable to move. Because this isn't just any dog. This is a highly trained police K9, and the girl he thought was helpless? She's the daughter of the officer who raised him. But by the time he realizes his mistake, it's too late, because this takedown is just the beginning. Who is this man? And what shocking truth will be uncovered once the police arrive? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The street lights cast long shadows across the empty sidewalk as Sophie pulled her navy hoodie tighter around her shoulders. The evening air had a sharp bite to it, making her grateful for the warmth of her well-worn sweatshirt. Her fingers, still smelling faintly of coffee from her shift at the cafe, rubbed together, seeking warmth. "Almost done, Ace," she said softly, to the Belgian Malinois padding silently beside her. His alert ears swiveled at every sound, but his relaxed posture told Sophie all was well. She hummed a quiet tune as they approached the ATM, her worn sneakers scuffing against the concrete. Across the street, hidden in the shadows of a narrow alley, Leo's hands trembled as he watched the girl and her dog. The rough fabric of the mask in his pocket seemed to burn against his skin. His stomach churned at what he was about to do, but Danny's frightened face flashed through his mind. His little brother was counting on him. "I'm sorry," he whispered to no one in particular, stepping out of the alley. His feet moved quickly, driven by desperation rather than confidence. The girl, Sophie, had just reached for her wallet when Leo lunged for her bag. Everything happened in a blur. Before Sophie could even draw breath to scream, Ace sprang into action. The dog moved like a well-oiled machine, precise and controlled as he slammed into Leo, taking him down with professional efficiency. There was no savage attack, no tearing or biting, just a firm, immobilizing hold. Leo gasped as his back hit the concrete, the air rushing from his lungs. The mask slipped from his grasp, revealing a young face etched with fear rather than malice. His hands shook as he lay pinned beneath the powerful dog. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Don't let them take me in. I didn't want to do this." Sophie stood frozen, her hand still gripping Ace's leash. Something wasn't right. Ace, normally fierce when subduing threats, stood calmly over Leo. His posture was alert but not aggressive, as if he sensed something in the young man that Sophie couldn't see. The wail of approaching sirens cut through the night air. Red and blue lights painted the buildings as a squad car pulled up to the curb. Officer Carter stepped out, his experienced eyes taking in the scene. When his gaze fell on Leo, recognition dawned on his face. "Leo," he said, disbelief coloring his voice. Leo's shoulders slumped in defeat. "I just needed time," he whispered, his voice heavy with despair. "My brother. They have him." Hours later, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the police station, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Sophie shifted in her uncomfortable plastic chair, her mind replaying the events of the evening. Ace lay at her feet, his chin resting on his paws, but his eyes remained fixed on the interrogation room where Leo sat. Something about the attack didn't add up. Sophie had seen Ace in action during training exercises. He was lethal when necessary, trained to eliminate genuine threats. Yet tonight, he'd shown remarkable restraint, almost as if he'd known Leo wasn't truly dangerous. Through the glass partition, she could see Leo fidgeting in his chair, the handcuffs glinting under the stark lighting. His leg bounced rapidly beneath the metal table, his eyes darting between the door and the clock on the wall. Detective Harris strode into the station, his badge catching the light as he moved. Officer Carter fell into step beside him as they approached the interrogation room. Sophie watched her father's face. She knew that expression. He was in full detective mode now. Inside the room, Harris leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. His voice carried through the glass, firm but measured. "Let's start from the top. Why did you attack my daughter?" Leo's shoulders slumped further, if that was possible. The words spilled out of him like water from a broken dam. He told them about Danny, his 12-year-old brother, snatched by loan sharks after their mother's medical bills had buried them in debt. The kidnappers had given him 24 hours to come up with money he didn't have. No job, no savings, nothing to sell. "I tried everything," Leo's voice cracked. "Banks, loan offices, even pawn shops. Nobody would help. The ATM, I panicked. Danny's all I have left." Harris and Officer Carter exchanged knowing looks. Sophie could read their expressions. They knew exactly who they were dealing with. These weren't ordinary criminals. These were the kind of people who made problems disappear permanently. When Harris stepped out of the interrogation room, his hand immediately went to his temples, massaging them in slow circles. Sophie stood up from her chair, Ace rising with her. She moved closer to her father, studying his troubled expression. "He's telling the truth, isn't he?" she asked quietly. Harris exhaled heavily, dropping his hand. He looked at his daughter and gave a single, grim nod. "Yeah," he admitted, "and if we don't find Danny soon, we might never." The kitchen was quiet, except for the soft scraping of Sophie's fork against her plate. The pasta her father had ordered sat mostly untouched, growing cold as she pushed it around listlessly. In the living room, she could hear snippets of her father's phone conversation, urgent, frustrated words as he tried to coordinate with other detectives to find Danny. Ace sat faithfully beside her chair, his brown eyes following her movements. His ears twitched each time she sighed, and occasionally he would nudge her leg with his nose, as if trying to comfort her. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking each moment that passed without progress. Sophie couldn't shake the image of Leo's face from her mind, the raw desperation, the shame, the fear for his brother. Later that afternoon, Sophie found herself at the police station, standing in front of Leo's holding cell. He looked smaller somehow, hunched on the metal bench, his eyes fixed on the floor. When he looked up and saw her, surprise flickered across his face. "You had a knife," she said quietly, her hands gripping the cold metal bars. "Why didn't you use it?" Leo blinked, confusion evident in his expression. "What?" "If you were that desperate, why didn't you actually hurt me? You just hesitated." Sophie's voice was steady, searching his face for answers. Leo's jaw clenched, and he looked away, shame coloring his features. "Because I didn't want to be that person," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I had no other choice." Sophie studied him carefully, noting the way his hands trembled slightly, the genuine regret in his eyes. He wasn't lying. In that moment, something clicked into place in her mind. She knew what they needed to do. That evening, Sophie walked purposefully into her father's home office. Detective Harris sat behind his desk, surrounded by case files and coffee cups, looking exhausted. "Dad, I have an idea," she announced. Harris looked up from his files, raising an eyebrow. "What is it?" "Ace," Sophie said, gesturing to the Belgian Malinois who had followed her into the room. "He can track scents, right? What if we use him to find Danny?" Her father sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that simple, Soph." But Sophie stood her ground, her voice firm. "You told me we're running out of time. Let's try." The first rays of sunlight crept over the city skyline as Detective Harris's police cruiser pulled up to a weathered apartment building. The brick facade was stained with age, and several windows were patched with cardboard. Sophie sat in the back seat with Ace, her hand resting on his neck for comfort. "Remember," Harris said, turning off the engine, "this might not work. Scent trails fade, especially in the city." Outside, Leo stood waiting, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. A police officer stood nearby, keeping watch over their temporary release arrangement. When Leo spotted Sophie, he shifted uncomfortably, but managed a small nod of gratitude. The group made their way up 3 flights of creaking stairs to Leo's apartment. The door stuck slightly as Leo unlocked it, revealing a small, sparse living space. A worn couch doubled as a bed, and a few dishes sat unwashed in the tiny kitchen sink. "Danny's stuff is in here," Leo said quietly, leading them to a small bedroom. The room was neat despite its shabby furniture. A twin bed sat against one wall, covered with a faded superhero blanket. Leo picked up a navy blue hoodie from the bed, holding it out. He wore this almost every day. Sophie watched as Ace approached the hoodie, his nose working carefully. The dog moved methodically around the room, sniffing a worn baseball cap on the dresser and pausing at a stuffed dog that had clearly been well loved. Suddenly, Ace's body went still. His ears shot up and his tail straightened. He turned toward the door, then looked back at Harry's, waiting for permission to proceed. Harris took a deep breath. "All right, boy. Show us what you've got." Ace burst into action, trotting purposefully down the hallway. They followed him down the stairs and out onto the street, where he picked up speed. The dog led them through a maze of narrow alleyways, some still wet from the previous night's rain. After several blocks, they came to an abandoned lot surrounded by chain-link fencing. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete, and old shipping containers rusted in the corners. Ace stopped abruptly, sniffing the ground with increasing intensity. "No!" Leo stepped forward, his voice rising with panic. "This has to be it. He was here." Sophie watched as Ace's body language changed dramatically. His tail became rigid, and the fur along his spine stood up. A low, threatening growl rumbled from his chest, his eyes fixed on something only he could sense. Sophie felt her blood run cold. She knew what that growl meant. Someone else had been here recently. Someone who wasn't Danny. The abandoned lot fell silent except for Ace's low, menacing growl. Sophie's heart pounded as she watched the Belgian Malinois' rigid stance. His ears were perked forward, nose twitching at something unseen. Detective Harris moved cautiously, his experienced eyes scanning the cluttered space. Rusted shipping containers loomed like silent sentinels, while scattered boxes and debris created dozens of potential hiding spots. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked pavement, making every dark corner seem suspicious. "He was here." "I know it," Leo said through clenched teeth, his voice tight with worry. Ace suddenly moved forward, his nails clicking against the concrete as he approached an overturned wooden crate. His nose worked frantically at the ground, and without warning, he let out a sharp, commanding bark that made everyone jump. Harris drew his weapon in one fluid motion, while Sophie and Leo stood frozen. Officer Carter moved to flank Harris, his own hand on his holster. But there was no ambush waiting. Instead, partially hidden behind the crate was a worn blue backpack. Leo rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside it. His hands shook as he unzipped the main compartment. "This is his," Leo's voice cracked as he pulled out the contents. A half-eaten peanut butter sandwich wrapped in plastic. A dog-eared school notebook with Danny's name scrawled on the cover. At the bottom of the bag, Leo found a crumpled piece of paper. He smoothed it out carefully, revealing a child's drawing of a dog. Harris crouched down, examining the damp pavement around them. The air carried a distinct mixture of smells. The sharp tang of motor oil, and the unmistakable brackish scent of harbor water. He looked up at Carter, their years of partnership allowing silent communication. "This place is too close to the docks," Harris muttered, his expression grim. "If they moved him, they probably put him on a boat." Leo's face drained of color. "No, they wouldn't." Sophie watched as her father pulled out his radio, signaling to his team. The implications were clear. The kidnappers had never intended to keep Danny. The proximity to the dock suggested something far more sinister. They weren't just hiding Danny. They were planning to make him disappear completely. Time was running out, and they all knew it. Detective Harris strode back and forth across his office, the weight of realization heavy in his steps. The Venetian blinds cast striped shadows across his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw. His fingers drummed against his thigh as he paced, a nervous habit he'd developed over years of difficult cases. This wasn't just a simple kidnapping anymore. The docks changed everything. Leo sat in a chair across from Sophie, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. Sweat beaded at his hairline despite the cool air conditioning. "I need to do something. I can't just sit here." His voice was rough with frustration and fear, cracking slightly on the last word. Sophie frowned, her fingers absently running through Ace's fur. The Belgian Malinois leaned against her leg, sensing the tension in the room. His ears twitched at every sound, staying alert even as he provided comfort. As much as she hated to admit it, Leo had a point. Sitting here wouldn't save Danny. Harris picked up his phone, dialing a number he rarely used. 20 minutes later, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair walked into the office, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. Reyes, a man who walked the line between law and crime, providing information when it suited him. Harris laid out the situation, his words clipped and precise. Reyes listened, his weathered face growing grimmer with each detail. When Harris finished, Reyes exhaled heavily, rubbing his temple with calloused fingers. "The syndicate you're dealing with?" Reyes' voice was gravelly, like stones grinding together. "They don't just sell drugs or run loan scams. They traffic people. If they've taken the kid to the docks, they're either planning to use him as leverage or—" He left the sentence hanging, but everyone in the room felt the weight of the unspoken words. Leo's face hardened, his eyes turning to steel. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Tell me where they are." "Absolutely not," Harris cut in sharply, whirling to face Leo. "You are not getting involved." Reyes watched the exchange with tired eyes before letting out a long sigh that seemed to deflate his whole body. "I know one guy who might know where they're keeping the kid." He paused, looking directly at Harris. "But he's not going to talk to a cop." Leo's jaw tightened as he looked at Harris. "Then I'll go." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. The determination in Leo's voice made it clear. This situation was about to become much more dangerous. She could see it in the set of his shoulders and the fierce light in his eyes. The fluorescent lights of the grimy diner buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow across the cracked vinyl seats. At midnight, the place was nearly empty, save for a sleepy waitress and an elderly man nursing a cold cup of coffee at the counter. Leo sat in the corner booth, his fingers drumming nervously on the sticky table surface. His eyes darted to the door every time the bell chimed, but Marco was nowhere to be seen. Across from him, Sophie sat with her arms crossed, her disapproval evident in every line of her body. "This is a bad idea," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Leo sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I didn't ask you to come. And yet, here I am." Sophie's tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. Under the table, Ace lay still as a statue, his ears perked and alert. The Belgian Malinois' presence was both comforting and intimidating, his muscled body ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. The bell chimed again, and this time Marco walked in. He was a thin man with sharp features and calculating eyes. His leather jacket was worn at the elbows, and his shoes were scuffed but expensive. He spotted Leo and Sophie, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he slid into the booth beside them. "Didn't think you had the guts to call me, Leo." Marco's eyes flickered to Sophie, amusement dancing in them. "And who's this? Your lawyer?" Sophie met his gaze with a cold glare. "Just tell us what we need to know." Marco chuckled, the sound hollow and mirthless. "You think I'm just going to give up info on my bosses? You must be new to this game." Leo leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I know you don't care about Danny, but I also know you don't want to get caught in the crossfire when Harris brings the full force of the department down on this syndicate." Marco's fingers began tapping on the table, a nervous rhythm that betrayed his casual demeanor. His eyes dropped to Ace, who stared back at him with unwavering focus. The dog's presence seemed to unsettle him more than any threats could. "There's a warehouse near Pier 17, Marco finally muttered, his voice barely audible over the diner's ambient noise. "Sometimes they keep deliveries there before they get shipped out." Leo's stomach turned at the way Marco said deliveries, knowing his little brother was being treated like cargo. Outside the diner, Sophie quickly pulled out her phone, her fingers flying over the keys as she texted Harris the location. Leo stood beside her, his fists clenched at his sides as he stared toward the darkened horizon where the docks waited. "Danny," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "hold on." The night air hung heavy with salt and diesel fumes as the small team crouched behind stacked shipping containers near Pier 17. Sophie could feel the tension radiating from Leo beside her, his shoulders rigid with worry. Ace stayed close to her feet, his muscled body still but alert. Harris kept his voice low as he spoke into his radio, checking positions with his undercover officers scattered around the perimeter. "We need to be smart about this. If we rush in and they panic, they might take the kid and run." Leo's breath came out in shaky bursts, his hands trembling as he peered around the corner at the warehouse. The distant sounds of dock workers unloading cargo echoed across the water, completely unaware of the rescue mission about to unfold. Sophie noticed Leo's distress and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "We'll get him back," she whispered, trying to steady him. The warehouse loomed before them, its metal walls weathered by years of sea spray. Ace's ears suddenly perked up, his nose twitching as he caught a scent. His head turned sharply toward one of the side entrances, and he let out a sharp, controlled bark, the signal they'd been waiting for. Harris immediately raised his hand, giving silent signals to his team. They moved like shadows across the concrete, their footsteps barely making a sound. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of wooden crates and metal containers. The air was stale and thick with dust. Following Ace's lead, they made their way to the back of the building. There, hidden behind stacks of cargo, they found what they were looking for, a makeshift holding area with a small, dimly lit room. A heavy padlock secured a metal cage inside, and curled up in the corner was a small figure. Leo froze, his entire body going rigid. Inside the cage, Danny lifted his head, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief in the dim light. "Leo!" Danny's voice was barely more than a whisper, cracking with emotion. Before Leo could move or respond, a cold voice cut through the darkness. "Well, well, looks like someone came to collect." The sound of footsteps echoed as a tall man emerged from behind a stack of crates, the metal of his gun glinting in the dim light. The warehouse air grew thick with tension as Leo stared at his little brother through the metal bars. Danny's face was streaked with dirt and tears, his usually bright eyes now dim with fear. Leo's heart hammered in his chest, every fiber of his being wanting to rush forward and break down that cage. But a slow, deliberate clap cut through the silence. The sound echoed off the metal walls, making Danny flinch. From behind a stack of wooden crates emerged a man in an expensive dark suit, his shoes clicking against the concrete floor. Victor Costa's face held a cold smirk as he stepped into the dim light, a gun hanging casually at his side. "Brave of you to come here, Leo," Victor said, his voice smooth as silk but laced with venom. "But I don't remember inviting guests." Harris raised his hand slightly, a silent signal to his hidden team to stay put. Next to Sophie, Ace's muscles tensed, his training evident in how still he remained despite the clear threat. His eyes never left Victor. Victor began to pace, each step slow and measured, like a cat playing with its prey. "You've caused a lot of trouble, Leo. You were supposed to be a simple debtor, not a hero." He shook his head in mock disappointment. "Now, you're making me reconsider my patience." Leo's hands balled into fists, his knuckles turning white. "Let my brother go," he demanded, his voice rough with emotion. "You got what you wanted, right? The debt was paid the second you took him." A low chuckle escaped Victor's throat. "Oh, Leo, you still don't get it, do you?" He gestured with his free hand. "This isn't about money anymore. It's about sending a message. If I let you walk out of here with the boy, what's stopping everyone else from thinking they can do the same?" Sophie grabbed Harris's sleeve, her fingers digging into the fabric. "We have to do something before he panics and hurts Danny," she whispered urgently. Her father gave a subtle nod, his eyes flickering to Ace for just a moment. With a barely perceptible hand signal from Harris, everything exploded into action. Ace launched forward like a missile, his powerful body becoming a blur of fur and muscle. Victor's eyes widened in surprise. He'd been so focused on the humans, he'd overlooked the dog. Before he could squeeze the trigger, Ace's jaws clamped down on his wrist with precise force. The gun clattered to the ground. The shadows erupted with gunfire, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like lightning. Gunfire exploded through the warehouse, bullets pinging off metal crates and sending sparks into the air. Sophie's heart slammed against her ribs as she ducked behind a large shipping container, her hands pressed against the cold metal. The sound was deafening, echoing off the walls like thunder. Leo didn't hesitate. As soon as the shooting started, he sprinted toward Danny's cage, his feet pounding against the concrete floor. His hands trembled as he grabbed the padlock, yanking at it desperately. Come on," he muttered, his voice cracking with fear and frustration. Across the warehouse, Ace had Victor backed against a wall. The dog's teeth were bared, his growls rumbling deep in his chest as blood dripped from Victor's wounded wrist onto his expensive suit. The enforcer's face had lost its smug confidence, replaced by a mix of pain and rage. "Stay down," Harris shouted, grabbing Sophie's arm and pulling her deeper into cover as another burst of gunfire rattled through the air. She pressed her back against the crate, her breath coming in short gasps, but her eyes remained fixed on Leo. Leo's gaze darted around frantically until it landed on a rusty crowbar lying on a nearby work table. He lunged for it, his fingers wrapping around the cold metal. With all his strength, he brought it down on the lock again and again until it finally broke with a sharp crack. Danny stared up at his brother through the now open cage door, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Leo!" His voice was small, trembling. "It's me, buddy. We're getting out of here." Leo reached in and pulled Danny into his arms, holding him tight against his chest. The moment of relief was shattered by the sound of metal scraping against leather. Victor had managed to reach down to his ankle, pulling out a hidden pistol. He raised it, aiming at the brothers. A furious snarl ripped through the air as Ace launched himself at Victor once more. The dog's powerful body slammed into the enforcer, sending them both crashing to the ground. The gun went off with a crack, the bullet whizzing past Leo's head and embedding itself in a wooden crate. Harris and his officers moved in swiftly, their weapons trained on Victor as they forced him face down on the concrete. Around them, some of Victor's men threw down their weapons and raised their hands, while others fled into the shadows of the warehouse. Leo grabbed Danny's hand, squeezing it tight as he led him toward the exit. His little brother's fingers trembled in his grip, but he held on like a lifeline. Red and blue police lights painted the warehouse exterior in alternating flashes, casting eerie shadows across the wet pavement. Officers marched Victor and his men toward the waiting squad cars, their handcuffs glinting in the strobing lights. Victor's face remained a stone mask as they pushed him into the back seat, but the blood-stained sleeve of his expensive suit told the story of his defeat. Leo's legs finally gave out. He sank down onto the cold pavement, his whole body trembling from exhaustion and relief. Danny stayed wrapped around him, refusing to let go even for a second. The young boy's face was buried in his brother's jacket, his small shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "I thought you wouldn't come," Danny whispered, his voice barely audible as his fingers clutched Leo's jacket tighter. "I was so scared." Leo pulled his little brother closer, resting his chin on Danny's head. "I'll always come for you, buddy. Always." His voice cracked on the words, and he had to swallow hard against the lump in his throat. Sophie stood a few yards away, watching the brothers' reunion. Ace pressed against her leg, his fur still bristling slightly from the fight, but his posture more relaxed now that the danger had passed. Her father spoke in low tones with his officers, gesturing toward the warehouse as evidence teams moved in and out. Harris walked over to where Sophie stood, running a hand through his graying hair. "Costa will go away for a long time," he told her, his voice carrying both satisfaction and weariness. "The syndicate just lost one of its key players. This won't erase them completely, but it's a damn good start." Sophie let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "And Leo?" she asked, glancing at where the brothers sat huddled together on the pavement. Harris followed her gaze, his expression thoughtful as he watched the young man who had tried to rob his daughter now comforting his traumatized brother. "That's a different story," he said quietly. Leo held Danny close, but his mind raced with uncertainty. He'd saved his brother, yes. But what came next? The attempted robbery, his connection to the syndicate? Would the police overlook those things? Or would saving Danny be enough to earn him another chance? 2 weeks after the warehouse incident, Leo sat rigidly in the courtroom, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The polished wooden benches and imposing architecture made him feel small, out of place in his borrowed suit that didn't quite fit right. At the back of the courtroom, Sophie watched intently, with Ace lying quietly at her feet, his amber eyes fixed on Leo. Leo's public defender shuffled through his papers, his expression grim. They'd been over this before. Despite helping take down Victor Costa and saving Danny, the attempted robbery couldn't simply be erased. The lawyer had warned Leo to prepare himself for several years behind bars. Detective Harris approached the witness stand, his steps measured and deliberate. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face as he was sworn in. Leo held his breath, wondering what Sophie's father would say about the man who had tried to rob his daughter. Leo Carter was desperate, yes, Harris began, his voice clear and steady. But what he did at that ATM was not an act of violence. It was an act of a man with no other options. He paused, making eye contact with the judge. And when it came down to it, he risked everything to do the right thing. The courtroom fell silent as the judge considered Harris's words. The only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of paper. Leo's heart pounded so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Finally, the judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Leo Carter, due to the unique circumstances of your case, I am sentencing you to a 1-year rehabilitation program, followed by 2 years of community service. You will also be under strict monitoring and must work closely with law enforcement during your rehabilitation." Leo blinked rapidly, sure he had misheard. No prison? No lost years? Beside Sophie, Danny burst into tears, the sound of his relief echoing through the courtroom. Outside the courthouse, sunlight warmed Leo's face as he stepped into the fresh air, feeling lighter than he had in years. He looked down at Sophie and Ace, who stood waiting at the bottom of the steps. "I owe you guys everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie smiled, reaching down to pat Ace's head. "Ace always knows who the good guys are." Leo stepped out of the courthouse, blinking in the bright sunlight. His mind still struggled to process the judge's verdict, 1 year in rehabilitation instead of prison. The weight that had been crushing his chest for weeks finally began to lift. Beside him, Danny hadn't let go of his arm since the ruling, his small fingers wrapped tightly around Leo's borrowed suit jacket. Sophie and Ace stood a few steps away, watching as Detective Harris spoke in hushed tones with another officer. The detective's face was stern as always, but something in his posture had softened. Harris approached them, his shoes clicking against the courthouse steps. "You got lucky, kid," he muttered, his voice gruff but not unkind. Leo swallowed hard and nodded. "I know." Reaching into his jacket pocket, Harris pulled out an official-looking document and held it out. "Your probation conditions start immediately. You'll be working under the Police Rehabilitation Program, specifically at the K-9 Training Center." Leo's eyes widened, and he nearly dropped the paper. "Wait, you mean with the police dogs?" Later that afternoon, a social worker drove Leo and Danny to their new home. The apartment was small but clean, with basic furniture and fresh paint on the walls. It wasn't much, just a living room, kitchenette, 2 tiny bedrooms, and a bathroom. But after everything they'd been through, it felt like a palace. Danny wandered through the rooms in awe, trailing his fingers along the walls as if to make sure they were real. The events of the past weeks had taken their toll, and exhaustion soon caught up with him. Leo helped him into bed in his new room, tucking him in like he used to when Danny was smaller. While Danny slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, Leo sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life as dusk settled in. His phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Ace is proud of you. I think I am too." Leo stared at the message for a long moment, a small smile tugging at his lips. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he typed back. "One step at a time, right?" In the quiet of his new apartment, Leo leaned back in his chair and exhaled deeply. Tomorrow, he would begin training alongside the same kind of dogs that had taken him down that night at the ATM. The irony wasn't lost on him. Leo stood at the entrance of the police K-9 training facility, his heart pounding against his ribs. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete yard, where several dogs were already training with their handlers. The facility was larger than he'd expected, a sprawling complex of kennels, training grounds, and administrative buildings. Officer Ray Castillo met him at the door. The man's weathered face and rigid posture spoke of decades of service. His dark eyes scanned Leo from head to toe, his expression unimpressed. "You're here because the judge gave you a break, not because you earned it," Castillo said, his voice as hard as the concrete beneath their feet. "If you don't take this seriously, you'll be back in that courtroom before you know it." Leo straightened his spine, forcing himself to meet Castillo's gaze. Understood. The morning quickly turned into a test of endurance. Castillo led Leo to the kennels, handed him cleaning supplies, and left him with simple instructions. Clean everything. The work was brutal. Leo's muscles burned as he scrubbed floors, hauled heavy bags of food, and cleaned what felt like endless kennels. The constant barking echoed off the walls, making his head throb. An hour into the work, sweat dripped from his forehead as he attacked a particularly stubborn stain on the kennel floor. The sound of familiar footsteps made him look up. Sophie stood there, Ace at her side, an amused smile playing on her lips. "Looks like you got the glamorous job," she teased. Leo shot her a half-hearted glare, but couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his mouth. To his surprise, Ace padded over and gently nudged his hand with his nose before trotting off toward the training field. Castillo, who had been watching from nearby, raised his eyebrows. "Huh," he muttered, genuine surprise coloring his voice. Ace doesn't usually warm up to new people that fast. Leo watched the Belgian Malinois disappear around the corner, a strange feeling settling in his chest, something between pride and hope. When evening finally came, Leo dragged himself to the small employee quarters where he'd be staying during his training. His muscles screamed in protest as he collapsed onto the narrow cot. The room was sparse, just a bed, a small desk, and a drawer for his clothes. But it was clean and quiet. For the first time in years, despite the aches and exhaustion, Leo felt like he was working towards something real. The weeks passed like a blur at the K-9 training facility. Leo found himself falling into a comfortable rhythm, waking before dawn, feeding the dogs, cleaning kennels, and slowly learning the basics of handling. His muscles had stopped aching quite so much, and the constant barking no longer gave him headaches. Danny was thriving, too. He'd started 8th grade at the local middle school, making friends and even joining the science club. Every afternoon, he'd sit at their small kitchen table, surrounded by textbooks and homework, looking more like the kid he was supposed to be, rather than the terrified boy they'd rescued from that cage. Leo watched his brother's transformation with a mixture of pride and relief. The shadows under Danny's eyes had faded, and his smile came more easily now. Even Officer Castillo had noticed the change in Leo, grudgingly allowing him to help with basic training exercises. But peace, as Leo had learned the hard way, was often temporary. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Leo was taking his lunch break when his phone buzzed. Marco's name flashed across the screen, making his heart skip a beat. The informant hadn't contacted him since that night at the diner. "Hey, man." Marco's voice was casual, but something in his tone made Leo's skin crawl. "What do you want?" "Word on the street is that some Acosta's guys ain't happy you're still breathing." Leo's stomach dropped. He gripped the phone tighter, moving away from the other handlers in the break room. "What do you mean?" "I mean, they know you helped the cops. And let's just say, they don't forgive and forget." "You telling me they're coming after me?" Leo's voice was barely above a whisper. Marco's dark chuckle sent chills down Leo's spine. "Maybe not you, but little Danny? That's another story." The phone nearly slipped from Leo's sweating palm. Without another word to Marco, he bolted from the break room. His feet pounded against the pavement as he ran to his car, his heart threatening to burst from his chest. The drive home was a blur of red lights and honking horns. Leo's hands shook on the steering wheel as he took corners too fast, praying Danny was safe. He shouldn't have left him alone. He should have known better. Should have. Leo practically fell out of the car when he reached their apartment building. He took the stairs 2 at a time, fumbling with his keys at their door before bursting inside. Danny sat at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, surrounded by math homework. He looked up, startled by Leo's dramatic entrance. "Leo, what's wrong?" But Leo wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on something through the window. A black sedan parked across the street, its engine idling. Even from this distance, he could make out the silhouette of someone watching their apartment. They had found them. Leo stood frozen at the window, his breath coming in short gasps as he stared at the black sedan across the street. The tinted windows revealed nothing, but he could feel eyes watching their apartment. The steady purr of the engine seemed to mock him, reminding him that the syndicate's reach was long and their memory even longer. Danny sat at the kitchen table, his math homework forgotten as he watched his brother's tense posture. "Leo, what's happening?" Before Leo could answer, there was a knock at the door. He jumped, but relaxed slightly when he heard Sophie's voice. "Leo, it's us." He quickly let Sophie and Ace in, immediately returning to his post by the window. Sophie joined him, following his gaze to the car below. Her expression darkened as understanding dawned. "They're keeping tabs on you," she muttered, her hand absently finding Ace's fur. The Belgian Malinois let out a low growl, his ears flattening against his head as he picked up on the tension in the room. Leo ran his hands through his hair, pacing the small living room. His mind raced through scenarios, each one worse than the last. If he ran, they would hunt him and Danny forever. If he stayed and fought, Danny could get caught in the crossfire again. He couldn't bear the thought of his little brother back in their hands. Sophie watched him pace, her arms crossed. "You have to tell Harris," she said firmly. "He can help protect you both." "No." Leo shook his head sharply. "If I do that, they'll come at us harder. You don't know how these guys work. They'll see it as another betrayal." "I don't want to run again." Danny's small voice cut through their argument. He stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, his homework clutched in his hands, eyes wide with fear. "Please, Leo. I like it here. I have friends now." Leo's fists clenched at his sides. The sight of his brother's pleading face made something shift inside him. He was tired of looking over his shoulder, tired of living in fear, tired of always being one step away from losing everything they'd built. That night, after Sophie and Ace had left, and Danny had finally fallen asleep, Leo sat in their dark living room. The black sedan was still there, its presence a constant reminder of the threat hanging over them. But as he watched it, something hardened in his resolve. If the syndicate wanted him to be scared, they were going to be very disappointed. He wasn't going to run, not this time. He was going to fight back. Leo sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The kitchen clock ticked away the early morning hours, each sound echoing in the quiet apartment, like a countdown to something inevitable. Shadows from passing cars occasionally swept across the walls, making his shoulders tense with each movement. In the bedroom down the hall, Danny slept peacefully, unaware of the danger that had crept back into their lives. Leo could hear his brother's soft breathing when the apartment fell completely silent. Sophie sat across from him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, worry etched in the lines around her eyes. Ace lay at her feet, his muscular body relaxed but alert, ears twitching at every small sound from outside. The Belgian Malinois hadn't left their side since they'd spotted the black sedan circling their block for the third time that evening. His presence was both comforting and a reminder of how serious their situation had become. "You're not really considering handling this on your own, are you?" Sophie's voice was quiet but firm, carrying that same tone she used when training difficult dogs. Leo exhaled heavily, his fingers tightening around the mug until his knuckles turned white. "I don't have a choice." "Yes, you do," she insisted, leaning forward, her dark eyes searching his face. "Tell my dad. He can help protect you both." Leo shook his head, his jaw clenching as memories of past encounters with the syndicate flashed through his mind. "If we bring the cops into this now, they'll come back twice as hard. The only way to stop them is to send a message. Make them understand I'm not playing their game anymore." Sophie pushed back her chair, the legs scraping against the linoleum floor with a harsh sound that made Ace's head snap up. "And how exactly do you plan to do that? Walk up to them and tell them to leave you alone? They're not exactly known for listening to reason." Leo leaned back, his mind racing through possibilities, each one more dangerous than the last. The solution was there, just out of reach, like a word on the tip of his tongue. Victor Costa might be locked up, but someone else had stepped into his shoes, someone hungrier for power. The syndicate was like a hydra. Cut off one head, and another grew back stronger, more vicious. Marco had mentioned a new leader, someone who made Costa look tame in comparison, and that thought alone made Leo's blood run cold. "I need to find out who's pulling the strings now," Leo murmured, more to himself than to Sophie, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie's face paled, and she gripped the edge of the table. "That's a suicide mission. You know what they do to people who ask too many questions." "Not if I have help," Leo said, his eyes falling on Ace. The dog's ears perked up at the attention, his intelligent eyes meeting Leo's gaze with an intensity that spoke of understanding. Something about that steady look gave Leo hope, reminded him he wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't going to fight alone, not this time. If the syndicate wanted him to be afraid, wanted him to cower like he had when he was younger, they were about to learn he wasn't that scared kid anymore. He had too much to protect now, too much to lose. The morning sun cast long shadows through the apartment windows as Leo pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over Marco's number for a moment before he pressed dial. Each ring felt like an eternity until Marco's voice finally crackled through the speaker. "You got any names?" Leo asked without preamble, his voice tight with tension. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a heavy sigh. "Man, you really don't know when to quit, do you?" "I don't have the luxury of quitting," Leo replied, running a hand through his disheveled hair. The weight of Danny's safety pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. The line went quiet for so long that Leo thought Marco had hung up. Finally, another deep sigh broke the silence. "All right, the guy who took over for Costa? His name is Jace Moretti, and trust me, he's worse than Costa ever was." Leo's stomach turned at the name. While he'd never met Moretti personally, his reputation preceded him like a dark cloud. Stories circulated through the streets about his methods, calculated, precise, and utterly merciless. Where Costa had been a blunt instrument, Moretti was a surgeon's blade. He didn't just eliminate problems, he dismantled them piece by piece. Later that morning in Harris's office, Leo shared what he'd learned. Sophie sat perched on the edge of her father's desk, while Ace lay alert at her feet. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier with each detail Leo revealed about Moretti's reputation. Harris leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "If Moretti is watching you, it means he's still deciding whether or not you're a threat," he mused, tapping his fingers against his desk. "Which means we have a small window of opportunity to act before he does." Sophie's brow furrowed as she crossed her arms. "So what do we do? Wait till he decides to come after Leo and Danny?" "No," Leo said firmly, standing up straighter. "We take the fight to him." Harris exhaled slowly, leaning forward to rest his elbows on his desk. His eyes fixed on Leo with an intensity that seemed to search for any hint of doubt. "You better be sure about this, kid. Once we move, there's no turning back." Leo met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm sure." Harris paced his office, laying out the plan to Leo and Sophie. "We're setting up a fake money exchange," he explained, his voice steady but tense. "Make Moretti think you're desperate enough to buy your way out of this mess." Leo nodded, his fingers drumming nervously against his thigh. "How much?" "Enough to make it believable. $500,000. We'll have marked bills, tracking devices, the works." Sophie watched from her position by the window, Ace sitting alert at her feet. "Is this really going to work?" "It has to," Leo replied, his voice stronger than he felt. At the designated meeting spot, an abandoned warehouse on the city's outskirts, Leo stood alone under the harsh fluorescent lights. His breath came out in visible puffs in the cold air. Somewhere in the darkness, he knew Sophie and Ace were positioned with Harris and the SWAT team, but he'd never felt more isolated. The sound of tires on gravel broke the silence. A black SUV pulled up, its headlights cutting through the gloom. Two men emerged first, their movements precise and practiced as they scanned the area. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs as a third figure stepped out. Jace Moretti. In person, Moretti carried himself with an air of casual authority. His expensive suit seemed out of place in the dingy warehouse, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, belonged perfectly in this world of shadows and threats. "Leo Carter," Moretti said, his voice smooth and controlled. "Costa spoke highly of you before he got himself locked up." Leo squared his shoulders, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Then you know I'm not someone who goes down easy." A small smirk played at the corner of Moretti's mouth. "And yet, here you are, looking for a way out." Leo could almost feel Harris preparing to give the signal, the tension in the air building to a breaking point. But before anyone could move, Moretti leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You really think I didn't see this setup coming?" Leo's blood ran cold, the carefully constructed plan crumbling around him in an instant. The warehouse air grew thick with tension as Moretti snapped his fingers. 3 more men materialized from the shadows, their guns gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Leo's heart pounded against his ribs as he realized how quickly their plan had unraveled. His fingers twitched at his sides, every instinct screaming at him to run, to fight, to do something. Before the SWAT team could make their move, Ace's deep growl cut through the silence, followed by a sharp, warning bark. The sound echoed off the warehouse walls, making Leo's skin prickle with fear. The German shepherd's hackles rose, his powerful body shifting into a defensive stance that spoke volumes about the danger they faced. Moretti's lips curved into an amused smile. "Your people are watching from the shadows." His voice carried a dangerous edge, smooth as silk but sharp as a blade. "Tell them to step out now, or this meeting turns into a bloodbath." His men tightened their grips on their weapons, the metal catching the light with deadly promise. Harris emerged from his hiding spot, badge raised high, his footsteps steady despite the tension. "Moretti, you're surrounded. Stand down," he commanded, his voice firm and authoritative. The badge caught the light, a symbol of authority that seemed almost fragile in this powder keg of a situation. A low chuckle escaped Moretti's throat. "Am I? Or did I just back you into a situation you can't control?" His attention shifted back to Leo, eyes glinting with something that looked almost like interest. His expensive suit seemed out of place in the grimy warehouse, a reminder of the power he wielded. "I could have had you killed days ago, but I didn't. Want to know why?" Leo swallowed hard, his mouth dry. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Sweat trickled down his back, his thoughts racing to Danny, waiting safely at home, or so he hoped. "Because I know talent when I see it, and I know desperation when I smell it." Moretti took a step closer, his expensive shoes clicking against the concrete floor, each step deliberate and measured. "You've got two options. Work for me." He paused, letting the words sink in, savoring the moment like a predator toying with its prey. "Or you and your brother disappear for good." Leo's jaw tightened as the weight of the choice pressed down on him. Either option meant destruction, refuse and die, or accept and drag Danny into an even darker world than the one they'd just escaped. His brother's face flashed through his mind, young and hopeful, still believing in a better tomorrow. Before Leo could form a response, Ace's body suddenly went rigid. The dog's ears perked up, his muscles tensing as if sensing an approaching threat. His tail lowered, and a low rumble started deep in his chest, a warning that only those who knew him would understand. Something was about to go very, very wrong. The warehouse fell into a deathly silence as Moretti's eyes bore into Leo, waiting for his answer. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor. Leo's chest felt tight, the weight of the impossible choice crushing him from all sides. Work for the man who had terrorized his brother, or risk both their lives? Ace's muscles coiled beside Sophie, his hackles rising as he let out a low, warning growl. The dog's instincts were screaming danger, and Sophie could feel it too. Her hand tightened on his leash, her knuckles white with tension. Harris maintained his position, his experienced eyes scanning the situation. His fingers hovered near his holster, ready to draw at a moment's notice. The air crackled with tension as everyone waited, frozen in this dangerous tableau. Moretti let out an exaggerated sigh, checking his expensive watch with theatrical annoyance. "Tick-tock, Leo. I don't have all day." His voice carried a hint of amusement, as if he was enjoying watching Leo squirm. Leo's mind raced through his options, each one worse than the last. Images of Danny flashed through his head, his little brother finally sleeping peacefully, finally feeling safe. He thought about the K-9 training center, about the second chance he'd been given, about Sophie and Ace, who had believed in him when no one else would. His fists clenched at his sides as he lifted his chin, meeting Moretti's gaze. "I don't work for scum like you." A smirk spread across Moretti's face, as if Leo's defiance was exactly what he'd expected. Shame. He raised his hand slightly, and one of his men lifted his gun. In that split second, Ace launched forward like a furry missile, his teeth flashing in the harsh light. The warehouse erupted into chaos as Harris's team stormed in from all sides, their boots thundering against the concrete. Gunfire exploded through the air as Moretti's men scattered, taking cover behind crates and pillars. Leo dove behind a stack of pallets, his heart hammering in his chest. But when he looked up, he realized Moretti wasn't running. Instead, the crime boss turned to face Leo, a cold smile spreading across his face. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." The warehouse erupted into chaos as SWAT officers swarmed in from every entrance. Gunfire echoed off the metal walls as Moretti's men found themselves overwhelmed, outgunned, and surrounded. One by one, they dropped their weapons and surrendered, realizing they were fighting a losing battle. But Moretti himself remained unnaturally calm. While his men fell around him, he simply straightened his expensive jacket and began walking toward a side exit, as if he were leaving a business meeting. Leo spotted his casual retreat and felt rage bubble up inside him. Without thinking, he sprinted after the crime boss. The cool night air hit Leo's face as he burst through the exit door. Ahead, Moretti was already reaching for the door handle of his black SUV. Leo's legs pumped harder, closing the distance. Just as Moretti's fingers touched the handle, Leo slammed into him full force, sending them both sprawling onto the rough asphalt. They rolled across the ground, trading blows. Leo managed to land a solid punch, but Moretti was faster than he looked. The crime boss dodged Leo's next swing and drove his fist deep into Leo's ribs, making him gasp in pain. Back and forth they went, neither gaining the upper hand. Blood trickled from Leo's split lip as he struggled to pin down his opponent. Moretti's perfectly pressed suit was now torn and dirty, but his eyes still held that same cold amusement. "You think this ends with me?" Moretti spat, blocking another punch. "You think locking me up makes you safe?" Leo wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand, his chest heaving. "I don't care. You don't get to hurt my family anymore." Moretti's hand moved to his jacket, reaching for something hidden there. The metallic glint of a knife caught the streetlight, but before he could use it, a familiar snarl filled the air. Ace burst out of nowhere, his powerful body slamming into Moretti and pinning him to the ground. Harris and his officers weren't far behind, rushing forward to secure the crime boss. As they snapped handcuffs around Moretti's wrists, Leo stood over him, still shaking with adrenaline. The man who had terrorized his family, who had threatened everything Leo held dear, was finally powerless. It was over. 2 weeks after Moretti's arrest, Leo sat on the concrete steps outside the police station, his eyes fixed on the city skyline. The afternoon sun painted the buildings in warm golden hues, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe easily. Danny was safe, sleeping soundly at night without nightmares. Moretti was locked away. The constant fear that had haunted them for so long had finally lifted. The familiar sound of paws on concrete made Leo turn his head. Sophie walked up the steps with Ace trotting beside her, his tail wagging slightly when he spotted Leo. The Belgian Malinois padded over and gently nudged Leo's hand with his nose, asking for attention. "He likes you now," Sophie observed, a small smile playing on her lips as she watched the interaction. "That's rare, you know. Ace doesn't warm up to many people." Leo chuckled softly, his fingers finding that sweet spot behind Ace's ears that made the dog's tail wag faster. "Yeah, well, we've been through a lot together, haven't we, boy?" Detective Harris emerged from the station, his hands tucked into his pockets as he approached the small group. His usual stern expression had softened somewhat as he looked at Leo. "The syndicate's finished," Harris announced, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "Moretti's looking at life behind bars. We're keeping an eye on things, but I don't think you'll have to worry about them anymore." Leo exhaled deeply, feeling the last remnants of tension leave his body. "Good." Harris studied him for a long moment, as if seeing him properly for the first time. "You did good, kid. I didn't think I'd say this, but maybe you've got something worth fighting for after all." Leo's gaze drifted to where Sophie stood, then through the station window where Danny sat inside, working on his homework. A small smile tugged at his lips. "Yeah," he said quietly, finally feeling at peace. "I do." 6 months after Moretti's arrest, Leo stood at the edge of the K-9 training field, his hands resting on the wooden fence, as he watched Danny work with a group of young rescue dogs. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and fresh grass. Ace sat beside him, his posture alert but relaxed, occasionally tilting his head as he observed the training session. Danny's laughter echoed across the field as one of the puppies, a German shepherd named Max, rolled over for belly rubs instead of following commands. The sight made Leo's chest warm with pride. His little brother had found his calling here, spending every free moment helping with the rescue dog program. Sophie approached quietly, leaning against the fence next to Leo. Her presence had become a constant comfort in his life, much like Ace's unwavering loyalty. "You thinking about staying?" she asked, her eyes following Danny's movements as he guided Max back to the training course. Leo watched as his brother demonstrated a basic command to the other trainers. his confidence growing with each passing day. "Yeah," he replied softly. "I think I am." The realization settled over him like a warm blanket. This place, which had started as his punishment, had become something else entirely. The K-9 unit wasn't just a job anymore. It was where he had found his purpose. Ace shifted beside him, pressing against his leg in that familiar way that always seemed to say more than words could. Leo couldn't help but smirk as he looked down at the Belgian Malinois. "Guess you're stuck with me now, buddy," he said, reaching down to scratch behind Ace's ears. The dog's tail wagged in response, and Leo could have sworn he saw approval in those intelligent eyes. As the training session wound down and the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Leo pulled a worn tennis ball from his pocket. Ace's ears immediately perked up, his entire body tensing with anticipation. Leo threw the ball across the field, watching as Ace burst into action, a blur of fur and muscle racing across the grass. There was something beautiful about watching him run, free, unburdened, living purely in the moment. For the first time in his life, Leo knew exactly how that felt. If you enjoyed the story of Leo and Ace, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.